Ian Stevenson was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry here when he became intrigued by cases of young children from various parts of the world who were reporting previous lives. And he wrote an article about the phenomenon, just sort of reviewing previously published cases from magazines or newspapers or whatever. After he did that, he began hearing about cases. So in 1961, he took his first research trip. He went to India, and he'd heard about 5 cases by the time he went there. He was there a few weeks and found 25 cases, and got similar results in Sri Lanka, and realized that this phenomenon was a lot more common than anyone had any idea about. Became more and more intrigued by the cases, eventually stepped down as chairman to investigate these cases full time. When he did so, he created this division in 1967. And he was able to do that in large part because Chester Carlson, who invented the Xeroxing process and of course had a lot of money, was funding the research. Chester Carlson then died a year later, and at that point Ian thought he'd have to go back into mainstream work until Chester Carlson's will was opened and it was found that he had left $1 million to the university. At that point, a controversy actually broke out about whether the university would even accept the money. And of course, universities are not in the habit of turning down $1 million gifts, but a lot of people found this work unsettling, but eventually, they did agree to take it, and the work has continued ever since then. Ian focused largely on the past life memory cases, but certainly not exclusively, and the division has continued to work on other areas as well. Bruce Grayson, who's the director now, focuses on near-death experiences. We're also looking at mediumship and other extraordinary experiences. I got involved with the work in the mid-90s. At that point, I was in private practice psychiatry, just having a nice mainstream career. When I became more open to these things, when I remarried, my wife was certainly open to things like psychic experiences, which got me curious about them. And I was reading one of Ian's books when we saw in the local newspaper that this division had gotten a new grant to study the effects that near-death experiences have on the people who have them. So I called up to see if they needed help interviewing patients for it. And one thing led to another. Started coming here an hour a week, and then eventually Ian asked me to come on half-time and then full-time, and now here I am. I do continue to do a lot of clinical work, seeing patients, but I also am involved in this research. And what this research involves, this phenomenon, is very young children, usually around the age of 2 or 3, who start saying that they remember a previous life. These children are found all over the world. They're easiest to find in cultures with a belief in reincarnation, but we're finding more and more American cases as well. And some of them talk about being deceased family members, but others describe being strangers in other locations, and if they give enough details, then people have often gone to those locations and found that in fact someone had died whose life matches the details that the child gave. The cases vary. There are some cases that are quite weak, where the child talks about a previous life but doesn't give enough details where a match has been located. And of course those aren't really the interesting ones. I mean, there are also some very strong cases where the child comes out with very specific details that would basically only match for one person that had lived. Strong cases can involve different aspects. Certainly for a child to make statements about a stranger who lived in another location some distance away is stronger than a child who's describing a family member or someone in the same village. And we've got lots of cases of both types, of both strangers versus same family cases or people in the same village. Obviously, the more verified statements, the stronger a case it is. Particularly if we've got written records, that makes it even stronger. Then you've got the birthmark and birth defect cases where you can get some incredible matches where both an entrance wound and an exit wound that matches where the previous person was shot and killed. That can certainly make for a very strong case. And then you've got the sort of associated features like the emotional longing or some of the behaviors like phobias related to the mode of death that the previous person, in cases where the previous person died violently, over 35% of the children show a phobia related to that mode of death. You get children who in their play will repeatedly act out something from the previous life, usually the previous occupation. And some of those can be the children can be very driven to do that repeatedly. So those sorts of associated features, when you see them along with a lot of specific statements, really make cases quite strong. In the strongest cases, the children have given a lot of very specific details, including a lot of names. There's one case in Lebanon that Ian Stevenson investigated where the child came out with 25 names of people from the previous life, and not just names, but their relationship to the previous person. And there are a number of others with similar type of specificity, although that girl holds the record for names. But for instance, there's a little girl in Sri Lanka, Purnima, who talked about the life of an incense maker who had been hit by a truck and killed, and she actually named the brands of incense that she said she was selling at the time. Those were brands that were not available locally, but eventually the family was able to track down this person who lived in the area where Purnima said he had lived, and he was killed on his bike selling incense, and the incense he was selling was the brands that she had named. And there are a number of others where you're talking about very specific details that seemingly the child had no way of knowing. And I think enough details where coincidence really is not a reasonable explanation. So, you know, they would certainly suggest that in some cases at least, there are some very strong memories and very specific memories that seemingly have carried over from somebody who died. Well, I think the most likely normal explanation for the cases is that the children make a few statements about a previous life, particularly in cultures with a belief in reincarnation where many of our cases take place. The family gets excited about it, finds somebody who died previously who matches in a general way to what the child said. Then once the families meet and compare notes, they end up thinking that the child had a lot more specific details about the previous life than the child actually had. So that is a possibility in many of the cases. However, it's not a possibility in cases where there is a written record of the statements that the child made before anyone tried to solve the case. We've got over 30 of those now. It would not explain the birthmark and birth defect cases where the children are born with marks or defects that match wounds, usually fatal wounds, on the body of the previous person. It would also not explain why many of these children express a lot of real emotional longing for the previous family before anyone's even discovered if there is such a previous family. I mean, there's a real emotional component to this. In addition, a couple of studies have been done to look at this possibility that faulty memory by the families is producing these cases. In one, Ian Stevenson as well as Sibo Scouten compared cases that had a written record of the statements that the child made before anyone ever looked versus cases where there was not a written record made ahead of time. With the idea being that if the families were unintentionally making these cases a lot stronger than they actually are, then the ones without the written records would have more statements because the families were saying that the child had said these things. But what they actually found was the reverse, that the ones with the written records had more statements. Statements being ones that the child made about their previous life that turned out to be accurate for the person that was identified. And presumably that's because with the written records, people could remember exactly what the child had said because they could just look at it on a piece of paper, whereas without the written records, the families tended to forget over time some of the statements that the child had made. So that study would go against the argument that it's just faulty memory. The other study that bears on this is Ian Stevenson and Jürgen Keil did a study where Jürgen reinvestigated cases that Ian had studied 20 years before. And he actually started that study by accident when he studied a case and then discovered that Ian had studied it many years before. But then he realized there was value in it, so he continued to do it, and he collected 15 cases to look to see if over the years they had been built up in the family's minds and had become more impressive than they were when Ian was on the scene earlier. And again, what he found was they had not become stronger. Many of the cases had become weaker. And that's because, again, the families had forgotten a lot of the details that they had known earlier on. So both of those studies really argue against the faulty memory by families possibility as an explanation for the strongest of these cases. Other possibilities that need to be considered, one would simply be coincidence that we've already talked about a little bit, that the child's statements just happen to match somebody who's found. And again, if the child's statements are general, then that certainly needs to be considered. But with a number of these cases, with the incredibly specific statements, that coincidence just seems as a preposterous explanation. Fraud certainly has to be considered. And I think anyone who reads Ian's case reports would agree that he's not committing fraud. I mean, he very carefully documents what has happened and also documents the weaknesses of the cases as well as the strengths. You have to consider whether the families are committing fraud. And in the vast majority of cases, there's just no reason to think they would because they don't gain anything from it whatsoever. And in addition, in a lot of the cases, there are a number of witnesses involved. So it would involve some grand conspiracy to accomplish nothing. And I mean, we know that this is a phenomenon that occurs. That the whole thing's not made out of whole cloth. And I think if anyone spent time with these families, they might decide that the families were deluding themselves, but I think they would agree that these are just straightforward, honest people who are not intentionally committing a fraud. It's not something where you can put a firm statistic on it, but we can certainly say that it's extremely unlikely that this would simply be due to coincidence. I mean, I think you can say that for an individual case, and then you multiply that by hundreds, then I think we can dismiss that as a possibility. A lot of these cases include a strong emotional component where there are numerous witnesses who say that the child begged to be taken to the previous family for years, sometimes crying literally on a daily basis for years to be taken to where they said their real parents were. And I mean, it's completely illogical to think that families would have coached a child to do that and then so that a couple of years later they could then take them somewhere. I don't think, with very rare exception, I don't think there's any reason to think that fraud is a likely explanation for the vast majority of these cases. We study children because they're the ones who spontaneously talk about past life memories. Our work does not involve hypnotic regression, but instead just this phenomenon of very young children, usually starting around the age of 2 or 3, who spontaneously say that they remember a previous life. The children usually stop making these statements by the age of 6 or 7. So, it's a very small window there in which to try to learn as much as possible. And some of the children say that they still, or some of the adults, if you look back, say they still had some memories, they just stopped talking about it. But most of them clearly just forget. So studying adults would be rather pointless because they don't have any of the memories. But the advantage of this phenomenon is that the children being so young have not been able to search the internet and find out details or whatever. I mean, you can be pretty sure in a lot of cases they have not learned the information through normal means, but it's something that they seem to have picked up in some sort of paranormal way. There are several areas that I want to continue to explore. One is I do want to continue to collect American cases, in particular, hopefully, stronger American cases, because I think if you look at ones that do not have any cultural influence, then they constitute an important subset. We'd like to continue to do some psychological testing, both of the children, which we've done in some small studies, but also I'd like to look a little bit at the parents to see if there are particular families that are more likely to produce children with these claims than others. The other thing that I've been focusing on is the database that we have for these cases. Now, we've got over 2,500 cases registered in our files. What we then do is take all the information from each case, put it in a coding form where we code for 200 variables for each case and then put them in a database. And that is very labor intensive. We've got about 1,400 of the cases in the database now, but that's enough where we can then look at things and see features that we've not been able to see from individual cases. So for instance, a few years ago I published a paper in which I had developed a scale that measured the strength of each case, where the computer would calculate it based on the variables. And what I found, among other things, was that in the stronger cases, the children tended to talk about the memories at an earlier age. They tended to show more emotion when they talked about the cases. And they even were judged to have more facial resemblance than children in the weaker cases. So all of those things argue that there was more sort of past life residue that came through, so it would make sense that they were with the stronger cases. At the same time, I looked to see, did the parents' initial attitude toward the case affect how strong it was? But with the idea being, if parents were very enthusiastic about a case, then they would build it up to make it look stronger than it actually was. And what I found was that there was no correlation. So the parents' initial attitude did not seem to affect how strong the case ultimately became. Well, we always approach this work with a scientific attitude. And you have people on both ends of the spectrum. You have people who are die-hard materialists who will dismiss whatever they hear along these lines. Then you have people who are firm, committed believers in reincarnation. But we're not on either of those ends. I mean, our approach is to try to determine as well as we can exactly what has happened in these cases, and then to determine what the best explanation for them is. And I think I tend to be both open and skeptical. I'm open to various possibilities, but I'm also, I haven't made my mind up. So I with each case, I look at it from a skeptical point of view. And that's really the approach that you have to do scientific work. So, we're trying to collect as much information as we can in as objective a manner as we can to really determine what's happened. Ian Stevenson has said proof is a term that should only be used in mathematics because what science involves is finding the best evidence, but not necessarily proof. So, for instance, there's not definitive proof necessarily that cigarettes cause lung cancer. There's absolutely overwhelming epidemiological evidence so that no one questions it, But it's again, it's just because there's so much evidence, not because there's proof. And certainly in medicine, I mean, we operate based on evidence instead of proof all the time. Medications are used because studies show that people get better on the medicine compared to placebo. That doesn't constitute proof that it works. It constitutes statistical evidence that it does. So that is a similar approach to what we're trying to do here, trying to figure out what the evidence indicates is the best explanation for these. What we're saying specifically is that there's this phenomenon of past life memories in young children that provides evidence that consciousness does not end with the death of the physical body, but instead can carry on and, at least in certain situations, can then carry over to another life. Now again, we're saying that there's evidence for this. We're not saying that there's proof, because again, this is a spontaneous phenomenon that does not occur in a controlled laboratory. But there is evidence that consciousness may be able to continue on.